This is R2D Tech, and today let's have a look at the Xiaomi Mi 10T Pro 5G, so stay tuned. In terms of design, this is quite a large and fairly heavy device, so for some people one-handed use may be quite difficult, but there are some benefits to having such a large device, like a much larger display, but we'll get onto that in just a minute. Other than that though, it's still very modern. It's got a classic punch hole camera in the top left corner, and then your classic glass sandwich with aluminium frame as well. There is quite an interesting looking camera module on the back, but we'll get onto that in just a bit. The display is 6.67 inches, which yes is really large and is definitely creeping into Galaxy S20 Ultra territory, but of course having a large display is really nice for viewing content and gaming and things like that. Now, it is an LCD panel unfortunately, not OLED, which does mean that you won't get the very true blacks that you would get on an OLED panel, but this specific one is actually quite good at offering really good vibrancy, contrast, and also almost true blacks. The main selling point though of this panel is actually that it's 144Hz refresh rate, which is absolutely insane for a smartphone. This will just make scrolling through the software and gaming and things like that so buttery smooth, especially with the specs that this phone packs, which we'll get onto in just a bit. Briefly onto software, you're not getting Android 11 straight out of the box, but you are getting Android 10, which is still really good, and of course that will have the MIUI 12 skin on top. Now, this is quite divisive in terms of whether you like this skin or not. I personally think it's really nice. They have added an app drawer. It doesn't look too far off stock Android. Granted, there are some major differences. You do get like a really nice control center which you can pull down from the top right corner. And I have to say it does look very suspiciously similar to the iOS control center. I mean, they probably don't call it that, but it basically is the same thing. I'm not complaining though, I think it's really nice, and I think the software is quite well thought out overall, but of course that's a matter of opinion. In terms of specs, this is another area where the phone really does shine, because you're getting the latest and greatest Snapdragon 865 chipset from Qualcomm, which of course is going to be really snappy since it is their flagship chipset. Now you're also getting the choice between 128GB or 256GB of storage, both of which would probably be fine, and both of which are paired with 8GB of RAM. Now 8GB of RAM is perfectly sufficient I think, but it would have been nice to see maybe 10 or 12 just because it will make the phone a bit more future proof. But to be honest, I've had a OnePlus 6 for a couple of years now, and that had 8GB of RAM and it was always absolutely fine, so I think these specs are absolutely great. Now onto the main camera unit on the back of the phone, you are getting a 108 megapixel main sensor, which is absolutely great. It just means you get so much detail in your photos. Then you're also getting a 13 megapixel ultra wide lens, which is perfectly sufficient in terms of pixel count, and it will be quite a useful thing to have, especially if you want to capture more things in your shot. And then the final sensor you're getting is a 5 megapixel macro lens, which I personally think is a bit of a gimmick, but it's always nice to have. In terms of the front selfie camera, you're getting a 20 megapixel lens, which is in the form of that punch hole camera as we mentioned earlier. This is quite a high megapixel count for a selfie camera, which I'm quite pleased by, and you should be able to get some really nice detailed shots from this front camera. Video is another area where this phone really stands out because you can film up to 8K 30 frames per second. I still can't believe that phones are filming at this resolution, so it's absolutely great. But of course it's not really the main reason to get this device, considering that 8K takes up a lot of storage and it will probably overheat your device as well, but it's still really impressive to have on a smartphone. And of course you can still film in 4K 60 frames per second, which is really great as well. And there are a couple of cool shooting modes, like one called clone mode, where you can kind of like get someone to walk across the scene and it will take multiple photos of them, so you'll have like multiple versions of the person in your photo. That is a very niche feature to have, but I still think it's pretty cool. Moving on to I/O, there are stereo speakers, but they're not that great. There's definitely an imbalance between the top speaker and the bottom speaker, where the bottom speaker is quite a lot more powerful, so I wouldn't say it's got the greatest speakers, but they'll probably be alright for day-to-day content viewing or gaming. Now, you don't get a headphone jack, which I guess isn't really that disappointing anymore in 2020, but I would have liked to see expandable storage, which you don't get on this device. You can, of course, still upload all your photos and stuff to the cloud, which I guess is becoming more popular nowadays than having lots of onboard storage. Now, you are also getting dual SIM, which is a useful feature for some people, but again is quite niche. Of course, though, you're getting USB-C, Apple, which is definitely the way to go nowadays. In terms of battery, you are getting an enormous 5,000 milliamp hour battery, which is really nice to see. Of course, LCD panels are slightly less efficient than OLED, and also since you're running 144 Hz as well on such a large display, it might drain the battery quite a bit. But since it is such an enormous battery, I definitely expect it to last through the full day. In addition to this, you are getting 33 watt charging straight out the box, because they do provide that power brick, unlike some other companies, not mentioning any names again, Apple. But that is really nice to see. The only slight letdown is that you don't get wireless charging on this device, and it does have a glass back, so I don't know why they didn't just throw this in. It's probably something to do with the pricing, but it would have been nice to see, especially since when you go to like cafes and stuff nowadays, they often do have wireless charging pads. Now, as usual, let's talk about a few extras. You get a side-mounted fingerprint sensor, which of course will be really fast since it is capacitive. It would have been cool to have an under-display one like some other phones nowadays, but of course that side-mounted one will probably be faster and more reliable anyway, so I'm not complaining. Now, there are 3 colors. There's Cosmic Black, Aurora Blue, or Lunar Silver. Those names are quite creative, so shout out to Xiaomi on that one. But then you are also getting 5G, of course, since this is a Snapdragon 865 phone. And that's quite useful, I guess, if you live in a 5G region, but I wouldn't buy the phone just for that reason, since it is a bit of a gimmick. The last thing to mention, of course, is price. If I'm not mistaken, this is going for around $599, so basically $600 in the US, which I think is pretty fair considering you're getting such flagship specs like that 144 Hz refresh rate and the Snapdragon 865 chipset. Now, of course, there are some trade-offs that we mentioned, like having an LCD panel, not having a really great speaker system, and also not having things like a headphone jack or expandable storage and some others like that. But overall, it is a really flagship device in my opinion, and I think it's definitely worth the money. That's it for this week. Again, it's been a really positive review. Of course, one of the main things to consider is whether you like MIUI as a software. I personally think it's quite nice, but it's all up to personal preference. If you did like the video, then please leave a thumbs up since it helps with the YouTube algorithm. And if you want to see more content like this in the future, then smash that subscribe button and notification bell below.